I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal life because Dwayne asked me to, and because, after all, I am my favorite subject, like most of us. This is why I liked interviewing so much. When I would interview for jobs when I was a young person, everybody asked me repeatedly about me. And who knows me better than me? And who likes me more than me? Almost nobody. I can talk about me all day, but I won't. In January 2007, my brand new beloved department head showed up, and it was actually a woman I did love. She was a mentor of mine years earlier at the University of Arizona. I arrived there in 1989, and she was there and was already an associate professor. She helped me go through the process of gaining tenure and establishing a reputation and so on. She was one of the few people at this Research One institution who really liked teaching, as I did, and so we would meet about that topic regularly. And then she became my department head, and I was involved in the process of hiring her. And in a one-on-one interview, I told her some of the stories about the libel of me by my own dean in the College of Agriculture and Life Science and various other activities. And she said, quote, "I will fall on my sword to protect your academic reputation." So imagine my surprise when, as her first administrative act, she banned me from teaching in my home department. This, by the way, was after I had already received the top advising award in my second year on campus in my home college, and also had received the top teaching and mentoring award in the graduate college, one of two transdisciplinary colleges at the University of Arizona. And so it wasn't as if my teaching abilities or my mentoring abilities were in question. This was before I was named Faculty of the Year by the Honors College. So here we have the two transdisciplinary colleges at the University of Arizona. I think I'm the only person in the history of the university to be awarded the top honors by both of these institutions. I'm also one of the relatively few people in history to be named full professor, tenured full professor before the age of 40. Think about this for a minute. Applicants for tenure track positions almost always number more than 100. So there's relatively few people who even get a PhD. And then of those relatively few people who get a PhD, a whole bunch of them are applying to the very few tenure track jobs that are out there. So it's generally 100 or more people applying for a job. One person lands that job. It's a very competitive process. And then fewer than half of those people are granted tenure, and only 7% make it to full professor. There are no statistics kept on this because it's so rare, but far fewer than that make it to full professor before the age of 40. I know of 3 people, and I was in the academy for a really long time. I know 3 people who have accomplished that in their lives. So I think I was actually quite good at what I did. But let's go back to this conversation. And I asked Lisa, why? You know, I'm actually quite good at what I do, and the students love my teaching, even though I give the lowest grades of anybody in the entire college. And so it's not like I was giving away the grades, and yet the students appreciated it anyway, so why? And she said, well, I don't need to answer that question. It's department head's prerogative to determine who teaches what classes, and I determined that you're not going to teach any. But I think what it boiled down to was I was teaching the unteachable. I was questioning the infinite growth paradigm, as it's known. Almost all of us throughout our entire lives subscribe by assumption to the infinite growth paradigm, that we can actually have infinite growth on a finite planet. We don't ever say it out loud because people would know we were insane. But every time you go to a bank, open a a checking account with a positive interest rate or a savings account with a positive interest rate, you're subscribing to the infinite growth paradigm, that money will always be worth more in the future than it is today. That we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. I was radicalized at a very early age when I was delivering my high school valedictorian address, as filled with hubris as any one human could be. I told my contemporaries that anyone can be a conformist, so you have to be a non-conformist. You have my permission. I look back at that now, I feel really ridiculous for stating it like that, but you know, I was young. You were all there once. By the time I was a few years into teaching in the academy, I was really starting to have my students question every aspect of the culture or the society in which we were embedded. And so I summarize those in this slide, Lies My Culture Tells Me. And of course, nobody goes around saying these things, because again, they don't make any sense. But we live them by assumption. The culture reinforces them by assumption. We assume the infinite growth paradigm. We assume that humans are superior to every other species on the planet. After all, what do we call non-human animals? We call them animals. When Trump really wants to make a point, he calls undocumented immigrants animals. Well, guess what? We're animals too. Occasionally, a biologist will come out just to make sure that everybody knows that we're animals too, and he or she will call those other animals lower or lesser animals. Really? You try to live out in the wild on acorns. You think you're smart? Try that for a few months. So, we just assume human superiority, we assume that more is better. We also assume that every generation will have more, and that alone will make each generation better off. And by more, we're generally talking about things like money and technology and access to information. We monetize the food, we monetize the water, we monetize the air. In 2016, I was touring New Zealand, and New Zealand air was being put into cans and shipped to Beijing, China, and sold for, I think it was 25 cents a breath, US. Yes, we're willing to do anything, and apparently everything, to foul the planet as long as we can put a price tag on it. This is new, by the way. This is not something indigenous people did. They didn't put a price tag on every single aspect of nature. How many times do we hear, if you just think positive, it's going to turn out fine? If you have stage 4 cancer and you think positive, you're going to die anyway. And by not coming to grips with reality, you might suffer a lot more than if you give up that positive thinking. Hope is a mistake. My favorite line from the movie Fury Road, the latest Mad Max movie. Can't believe I watched this stuff. I didn't watch movies for almost 40 years. And then I got connected with a woman who watches movies, and now I'm watching movies. I think my brain is rotting. But there's a great line, a protagonist turns to this woman who's talking about hope, and he says, hope is a mistake. If you can't fix what's broken, it'll drive you insane. That's what hope is. Hope is wishing for a different outcome in the future. It's the opposite side of the coin that has fear on the one side. We fear the future, we hope for the future, we don't do anything. We just think somebody's going to fix it or make it worse. Both of those dismiss action as well as reality. This civilization, like all of its predecessors, is characterized by endemic racism, endemic misogyny, and endemic monetary disparity, leading to poverty. And when the President of the United States exhibits these characteristics, people are surprised that he was elected. Really?
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Number one, I'm not a Trump fan, but he did not say that all the Mexicans coming across the border were animals. He said MS-13 gang was animals. And secondly, the anti-sexism, the sexism and the misogyny and all that other stuff is just as rough, it's just as boiling in the mainstream media as it is on any side of the political spectrum.
I certainly am not going to argue with that. My point is that what we're seeing in this country is a manifestation of a civilization that is nearing its end. We've been going a long time with a misogynistic, racist culture in this country. It's not new. And it's a part of every civilization so far that has been well studied. In any event, we assume in this culture that these things are not happening, that pretty much every aspect of civilization is good, when in fact if you dig a little bit beneath the surface, you see what's required to maintain this set of living arrangements, which means pollution and clear cuts and fouling the air and dirtying the water and eroding the soil and so forth. So it's not all good news. I was trying to point these things out to my students, and administrators feel strongly about that. What I want to talk about today, I want to focus on one outcome of civilization, and that is abrupt, irreversible climate change. We've known about climate change for a really long time. George Perkins Marsh warned about burning fossil fuels in 1851 and causing overall planetary warming. The first refereed journal article on the topic was written and published in April of 1896 by Svante Arrhenius, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So we've known about the impacts of burning fossil fuels on trapping heat within the atmosphere for a really long time. This is no surprise. The new thing, what we have only relatively recently learned about, is abrupt climate change based on primarily sediment records from the ocean, and irreversible climate change. So those are relatively new attributes. It's pretty clear that we've taken the situation beyond human control at this point. I'd like to point out this graph very briefly. It shows the global average temperature for the last 2 billion years on Earth. And you can see that most of that time is spent right here at 22 degrees Celsius, about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And occasionally we come out of hothouse Earth, and there's a little bit of a stable period here, and we go down to Ice Age, 12 degrees Celsius or 54 degrees Fahrenheit. And then there's relatively abrupt changes both ways, coming and going. And so we're in the midst now, in the relatively early stages. This is where civilizations first formed on Earth at 13.5 degrees Celsius. We're now nearly 2 degrees above that point, about right here. And we're headed for a much higher temperature in a very short period of time. And that's no particular surprise, because we see that it has happened many times in planetary history. It's just that this time, we triggered it by burning the fossil fuels instead of having the carbon dioxide released out of the oceans and triggering it, as has been the case in previous occasions. A little context. Even gradual change, the kind of relatively slow, seemingly controllable increase in global average temperature outstrips the ability of organisms to adapt, and most notably, as shown in this study from 2013, vertebrate species. Well, we're vertebrates too. Quintero and Wiens looked at more than 500 species and indicated that the rates of niche evolution over the course of the next 100 years would have to change at a rate 10,000 times faster, 5 orders of magnitude faster than rates typically observed among species. So that's really, really fast. And that's with the Al Gore relatively slow, gradual climate change that most of us are familiar with as triggered by greenhouse gases. That has nothing to do with abrupt climate change. Now, we've been warned. The United Nations director of the United Nations Environment Program from New York, the New York office of the UNEP, indicated in 1989 that we have a 10-year window to solve what he called the greenhouse effect problem. So we're spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's going to come back to bite us if we don't do something about that relatively soon. Well, of course we did something relatively soon. We ramped up greenhouse gas production at an ever-accelerating pace. And then it's not just one person now, a year and a half later, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, a distinguished body comprised of many scientists, concludes that we have an upper target that we absolutely cannot cross. And that's 1 degree Celsius above the 1750 baseline, when the global average temperature was about 13.5 degrees Celsius. He said, somewhere below 1 degree C, we're going to trigger these self-reinforcing feedback loops, or rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. So the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases in October of 1990, when they issued the report, knew that we are human animals, and that as a result we depend upon habitat for our own survival. And if we produce extensive ecosystem damage, then we're going to end up like the livestock in this picture from the 1950s. Because we require habitat too. As animals, as with all other animals and plants, we require habitat, which is primarily comprised of the ability to secure water, secure food, and secure air. It seems so simple when you put it like that. David Spratt, climate speaker and writer, comes along many years later and says, probably we triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops at somewhere between 1/4 degree and 1/2 degree. But those self-reinforcing feedback loops have already been triggered and are now causing rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses. And so even in 2014, it was obvious that there was extensive ecosystem damage going on. I indicated we're human animals, we require habitat to survive. I'm a conservation biologist, and conservation biology is underlain by 3 pillars: speciation, when and with what predecessors a new species comes into existence. Our species, Homo sapiens, came into existence about 300,000 years ago, with a few other species of the genus Homo as our predecessors, and ultimately going back 3.4 million years or so to a common ancestor with extant great apes. The second pillar is extinction, when the last individual of a species goes extinct. And the third, and perhaps the most important and least well understood, is habitat. Habitat, habitat, habitat. What does an organism need to survive? The Merriam-Webster dictionary simplifies and says habitat is the place or environment where a plant or animal typically lives and grows. So people tell me all the time that we're going to be fine, we just need to go to nuclear submarines in the ocean, the International Space Station, McMurdo Station in Antarctica, and so on. But these are not habitat. These are not places where human animals typically live and grow. Yes, we can persist there for a while. How? By transporting in food, and sometimes water, and the ability to purify the air from here where we have habitat. So this is where we typically live and grow, is here in the wild ecosystems comprising Earth. In any event, we've been warned, and for the most part, the response to that warning has been to leap over the cliff while looking at our favorite brand of technology. And I'm as guilty as anybody, don't get me wrong, that I'm the third guy there, the one 1 foot over the, as my high school math and science teacher used to say, "Mister, you have 1 foot out the door and the other on a banana peel." That's when I was in trouble. So that's me. You know, this is what we do. We're just enamored with the toys, and we think somebody's always going to be there to fix it. I want to present 2 paradoxes, a brief mention of the 6th mass extinction, and then the really bad news. So the 2 paradoxes, the first is that civilization is a heat engine driving us to extinction. I'll give just a brief overview before I go into the details. Terminating extinction actually heats the planet even faster than just maintaining this omnicidal set of living arrangements. That makes it sound bad. The second paradox, geoengineering must be employed, according to a whole bunch of people. And there's no evidence indicating geoengineering at the kind of scale we're talking about will actually work. Well, of course I knew about civilization as a heat engine as a conservation biologist before it was ever published in the refereed journal literature. So my personal response to that conclusion was to lead the way off-grid and away from civilization. So I just assumed, since I was a successful teacher, that everybody would follow along. Can you spell stupid for me? I mean, really, hubris again. To think that because I walked away from what I viewed as an imperial set of living arrangements, because I was pointing out that civilization has its downsides, to think that other people would follow along is ridiculous. I mean, think about how difficult it is to change yourself in light of new information. How many of us look at new information that actually could turn our world upside down and have it turn our world upside down? Almost nobody. Much less when you hear it from somebody else. I should have known. I've been teaching for more than 20 years, and every single class I ever taught, I emphasized that no significant problem on the planet can be improved by adding more people. And every single one of my students went out and had babies. And I should have inspected that and gone, you know, I'm not really having much impact here. So why do I think walking away from empire will cause a bunch of people to follow behind me? Well, it didn't, but I learned a lot. So I lived in a straw bale house with solar panels, and I learned how to make biochar to improve the soil and capture carbon out of the atmosphere, grow food and build structures. That's all great. I sure did get old in a hurry, though. So the details. We all know about the greenhouse effect and how that is warming up the planet. We all know that civilization has these dire consequences, including fouling the air and dirtying the water and, you know, all those things I mentioned earlier. And as it turns out, finally the refereed journal literature catches up with a paper by Tim Garrett, published in 2011 officially. Tim Garrett is now the department head in the Atmospheric Sciences Department at the University of Utah. But he was an associate professor at this time. He wrote this article and submitted it to 10 different journals as early as 2007. It was finally published electronically in November 2009 in the prestigious journal Climatic Change. And I suspect only for one reason was it published there. Well, 2 reasons. One, it went through the peer review process and it cleared peer review, and these conservative peer reviewers couldn't find anything technically wrong with it. And so it was imminently publishable. And 2, Stephen Schneider, the editor, was on his deathbed. So the paper was published electronically, November 2009. Tim Garrett then went through hell because dozens of well-paid, leisurely living academic scientists, people like me, attacked him. You're telling me that the way I live is causing problems? His work is based on the laws of thermodynamics. And he found that based on thermodynamics, no matter how we maintain civilization, Solar panels, wind turbines, wave power, whatever, civilization itself is a heat engine. And nobody wants to know that. I don't want to be blamed for this, much less in the hallowed halls of academia, where they take civilization very seriously and view it as a uniformly good thing. So it was withdrawn from publication right after it was published, and then it was finally printed in February 2011 with 2 responses to which Garrett was not allowed to respond from labs that didn't take issue with the evidence, only with the idea that they might.
Collapse of civilization causes the temperature to rise paradoxically. We know about greenhouse gases trapping the Earth, but at the same time that those greenhouse gases resulting from industrial activity are put up into the atmosphere and trapping heat, aerosols associated with burning fossil fuels, especially coal, especially, quote, poor quality or unclean coal, they produce sulfates which act as an umbrella. So paradoxically, at the same time we're warming the planet, we're also cooling the planet. If it weren't for those aerosols in the atmosphere right now, the planet would be a lot hotter than it is. If it was just the greenhouse effect, it would be a lot hotter. But it's 2 things at the same time. The original paper, to my knowledge, done on the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming, was published in December 2011 by Hansen and colleagues, who pointed out 1.2 plus or minus 2.2 degrees temperature rise in a span of about 6 weeks. So if we turn off the switch of civilization, say as soon as I'm done speaking here, so I have the projector for the whole thing, we turn off the switch in an hour, say. In about 6 weeks, all those aerosols will fall out of the atmosphere and the temperature of the planet will heat up catastrophically fast. And if it was only 1 degree C, that would be way too fast for almost any organism on the planet to keep up. We depend upon all those plants, remember, all those mycorrhizae fungi, and all those microbes, and all those bacteria. It's a complex web out there, and if it weren't for all them, we wouldn't be here today. And if we experience a 1 degree Celsius temperature rise in a span of 6 weeks, we wouldn't have probably 90% of those species in a very short period of time, within a year or 2. Because there's just no keeping up with that rate of change. It's all about the rate of change. And then a subsequent paper demonstrated that the previous paper was conservative, and this happens a lot with scientific endeavors, with the academic process. The earlier papers are pointed out as being relatively conservative. So, collapse of civilization leads to a temperature rise very abruptly. We're currently at about 1.73 degrees Celsius over the 1750 baseline. You don't hear that much. Almost always what you hear these days is the baseline isn't 1750 anymore. It's 1980. This is shifting baseline. Shifting the baseline to look the crisis, make it look like the crisis isn't nearly as bad as it is. So even James Hansen uses 1850 instead of 1750, thereby ignoring the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of people, most people in the corporate media, use 1981 to 2011 or something like that as the basis for their new baseline. So if we use the 1750 baseline, which is probably too late, but let's go with that anyway because it's conservative, then we're the current 1.73, if we tack on 3 to that, that gets us to a really, really high number in a short period of time. And I think 1 is probably enough to do us in, given the rapidity of change in the absence of there's aerosols in the atmosphere. And as pointed out in a paper by Oliver Tickell in The Guardian on Planet 4C, how our world can prepare for its extinction. So that's inconvenient. Tom Hartman wrote a book, I think it was published in 2012 or 2013, titled The Crash of 2016, and he's talking about the economic collapse that was on the way, and I suspect it's still on the way. I think Hartman wasn't wrong. I think he was ahead of his time on this issue as he is with respect to so many others. In fact, if you look back to the Great Depression, from today back to the big crash of 1929, you observe that all the big financial crashes, the stock market crashes, come in September, occasionally October, almost always September, and they come about every 7 years. The global financial crisis was in 2008. It seems like about 10 years to me. So I think we're overdue for the crash of 2016. When I first saw this book, I thought Hartman is being incredibly conservative. There's no way the system holds till then, and yet here we are. Second paradox is that global warming, climate change, is irreversible without massive geoengineering of the atmosphere's chemistry. This is a conclusion reached by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a very conservative organization. This body is so conservative, they only allow into their assessments, which happen every 5 or 10 years, they only allow information into those assessments from the referee journal literature. That's where the process starts. So say we're starting the process 2 years ago, in 2016. Only literature published up till 2016 is allowed in. It takes 5 years or so for the process to run its course, for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to come up with their latest assessment. So by the time the thing is published in 2020 or 2021, it's going to be relying upon information that is ancient. Bear in mind that it takes years to get a paper published in the referee journal literature. I pointed out the paper by Tim Garrett earlier, written and submitted in 2007 to 10 journals, finally published officially in 2011. That's typical. So this is a very conservative body using a very conservative set of tactics, and then in each of the working groups requiring consensus on every point before any information goes forward. Where does it go forward to? Political bodies, which then change the wording. That's the most polite way I can say that. Truth Out nailed this one when, in a response to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment, officially out in 2014, but heavily leaked beginning in September 2013, when they conclude that we need to geoengineer, Truth Out says we don't know how to do that. And Truth Out isn't the only one. Not long later, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences organized a group of scientists, and they reached the same conclusion, as did a European body of similar stature. So it's not just the crazy folks at Truth Out. It's not just the incredibly conservative folks at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the U.S. National Academy of Sciences pointing out with an incredibly robust synthetic treatment of the topic that geoengineering is not going to help and probably will make the situation worse. Probably will make the situation worse. And of course, you look at every attempt by humans to do some large-scale fixing of any problem throughout human history, and how many times has that actually made things better compared to the law of unintended consequence? And yet, Hansen and colleagues wrote a paper last year, Young People's Burden, the requirement of negative CO2 emissions. The paper concludes that we need to geoengineer. And in fact, it goes a step further. It says young people need to geoengineer. So James Hansen and colleagues take the blame. Our generation screwed the planet, and the next generation is going to have to fix it. Can you say equity? This is obscene. So we have these two paradoxes, and as if that isn't enough, we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction on planet Earth. Finally, 2 decades into scientists writing books for the lay public about the sixth mass extinction that's underway, finally the scientific community, the academic community, the referee journal literature community concludes, yeah, we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. This is how conservative the whole process is. So the first paper, the first published paper to come out on the topic was in 2015 in Science Advances, called Accelerated Modern Human-Induced Species Losses. How's that for a catchy title? Yeah, CBS is going to hang right onto that. Entering the sixth mass extinction, and the lead author, Gerardo Ceballos, points out that life would take many millions of years to recover. and our species itself would likely disappear early on. Well, of course, because we depend upon so many other species for our own existence. That said, the United Nations Environment Program put out a report in August 2010 estimating that the current rate of extinction was 150 to 200 species a day. So for 8 years we've been driving to extinction 150 to 200 species a day, and humans aren't gone yet. So apparently ours won't be among the first species to disappear. Second paper on the topic, also by Ceballos and colleagues, this one published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, is much more appropriately titled Biological Annihilation. This is the most conservative process probably in the history of the science of humanity. To have in the title Biological Annihilation, this is not the National Enquirer by the checkout stand at the grocery store. Biological annihilation, I was shocked when I saw this come out and saw this in the title of a referee journal article. Biological annihilation by the ongoing, at this point it's ongoing, it's not entering the sixth mass extinction, it's ongoing as it has been since at least 2010, when the United Nations Environment Program pointed out in an August report that we're driving to extinction some estimated 150 to 200 species a day. So it's been ongoing for a while. And quoting from the abstract and from the final sentence here, the biological annihilation underlies the seriousness for humanity of Earth's ongoing sixth mass extinction event. The final sentence in the paper is, all signs point to ever more powerful assaults on biodiversity, pointing a dismal picture of the future of life, including human life. Well, of course. Okay, and now I'm afraid to say I have the bad news. I've been sugarcoating it up to this point because I want to ease this whole thing in for you. It's way worse than I pointed out so far. Way worse. I mean, we're relying upon the referee journal literature. I'm quoting the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, perhaps the most conservative scientific body in the history of the planet. Of course it's going to be worse than I suggested so far. At this point, it's all about the ice. Specifically, it's all about the planetary air conditioner known as the Arctic ice. Paper in the, again, incredibly conservative annual review. The referee journal literature is unbelievably conservative. You have no idea, really. Most of you have no idea how incredibly conservative this process is. And the most conservative of the referee journal literature is the annual reviews. So here we are in the annual review of Earth and Planetary Sciences 2012, paper by Maslowski and colleagues. 3 of the 4 authors are working for the U.S. Naval Postgraduate College. So it's not like they're a bunch of, commie wackos. These are conservative people working for conservative organizations, publishing conservative outlet. And the paper is called The Future of Arctic Sea Ice. And they project that at this rate it would take until 2016 plus or minus 3 years to reach a nearly ice-free Arctic Ocean in the summer. And they say nearly ice-free Arctic because by scientific consensus, an ice-free Arctic is defined as less than 1 million square kilometers of ice on the Arctic. So we tend to think of science as being very precise, but in this case, 0 equals a million. Anything less than a million is said to be ice-free. And the reason for that is it's really difficult to measure by satellite observation every little bit of ice that's tucked into a cove here and a bay there and an inlet over here. So it's very difficult to get that last million square kilometers. So when we say an ice-free Arctic, we're really talking about very little ice, not necessarily 0 ice. Now, in a joint press conference with President Trump from about a year ago, the president of Finland says, I can't even begin to pronounce his last name, if we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality. And what he means is we lose the Arctic ice, we lose habitat for humans on Earth. I mentioned already that we need habitat, just like other animals. the habitat for civilization includes the ability to grow, store, and distribute grains at scale. If we lose the ice in the Arctic Ocean, we lose the planetary air conditioner, we lose the ability, we lose the cool, stable temperature that has allowed us to grow grains for the first time in human history. If we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality. And 2016, plus or minus 3 years, I'm stunned it hasn't happened already. It appears at this point, projecting forward from yesterday, when the latest data are available, that we'll have an ice-free Arctic in 20 days from yesterday. So what is today, the 7th? Is that true?
Yes.
So that will make yesterday the 6th, if I'm doing the math right. And so that means on July 26th, oh, my brother's birthday. How nice. We could have an ice-free Arctic, or nearly ice-free Arctic. And it might take a little longer than that. It might take until August. You know, these projections are difficult to make because the situation changes on a daily basis. Mostly with respect to climate change, the situation gets worse every day. But there are some surprises out there. So it might cool down. We might not have an ice-free Arctic soon, but I strongly suspect we're going to have that ice-free Arctic by the end of the melt season, which is coincident with the autumnal equinox, approximately the 20th or 21st of September. So we have all that time between now and then that's the melt season, and I'd be shocked if we don't have an ice-free Arctic at some point. What that means is very soon thereafter, because of methane release, because of latent heat, because of having no white ice to reflect back the incoming solar radiation, instead of having a blue ocean that soaks up all the heat. Because of all those separate but interrelated factors, I suspect we don't have long with an ice-free Arctic, because before we have no habitat and we have the inability to grow grains at scale. Will it be sufficient to destroy the corn harvest this year and thereby significantly disrupt civilization? I don't know. It's already too late to disrupt the wheat harvest, so maybe that'll get us through until next summer, even if we have an ice-free Arctic this summer. But it would surprise me. It would surprise me if we don't have the long overdue economic collapse that leads to very abrupt warming. It would surprise me if we have sufficient ice in the Arctic late enough in the season that we can avoid significant reduction in the grain harvest this year. But I don't know. And I don't know anybody who does know. And I think anybody who says with supreme confidence that they know is probably a questionable source. I think we don't have long. I suspect that this September or October, because that's the historical pattern, we lose habitat for our favorite species in a short period of time. But I don't know. Could be next year. It would surprise me if we had a year beyond that. Very, very much. I'd be ecstatic about it, don't get me wrong.
Trump knows your whole thing's a hoax.
Yes, yes, he does. A Chinese hoax, no less.
Trust me, we don't have any proof. One Chinese person.
The voice of reason speaks up. So I don't want this to happen. I'm routinely called the world's leading promoter of human extinction. No, I'm not promoting human extinction. I'm not out there like a barker in front of a carnival saying this is what we need to have happen.
Step right up.
Exactly. I don't want this to happen. This is not my favorite thing. But I think it's going to happen in the very near future. And it shouldn't come as a big surprise, really. I mean, look at our record. You know, we think we're amazing because we have smartphones. And at some level we are. We think we're amazing because we can all drive around with them. We have harnessed the power of an internal combustion engine like no other previous humans. We are amazing. All that's true. And yet, could you have imagined when you were a kid that we can have all these things, everything except flying cars, and not have adverse consequences? There's no such thing as a free lunch. So, what to do? what to do with the terminal diagnosis. I suspect everybody in this room doesn't have long, because we lose habitat, and then we lose the ability of our species to be supported on the planet, and then not long after that, we go away. And I don't care if you're living on a bunker with like-minded sociopaths, you're still gonna die. If there are people on the planet a few years from now, I'm not going to put any number on it, but a few years from now, they will be living in a bunker immersed in ionizing radiation because the world's 450 and change nuclear power plants melted down catastrophically, so there's ionizing radiation spewing into the sky. They will be alternatively freezing and too hot, they'll be hungry, they'll be really angry with each other. And probably the last human will eat a like-minded sociopath in one of those bunkers. That's not the way I want to go. So I used to be a prepper. I had this homestead in New Mexico where I was preparing for linear, gradual climate change and various other assaults on the environment. And I don't do that anymore because the situation in the last 10 years has become increasingly clear that we're headed for a planet without very much life on it. The 6th mass extinction, like the previous ones, will leave us with microbes and fungi and bacteria, oh my, things that are pretty small. And big multicellular organisms like us are not going to fare well, and it'll take millions of years to recover. And I didn't have that much food stored. So how do we live with a terminal diagnosis? Almost nobody on their deathbed says, I should have bought more crap. Nobody does that. Imelda Marcos did not take into her final moment, oh, for another pair of shoes. Right? And if you think about it, at the end of the day, that's not what marks you as a human, as a humane human being. You're not thinking about as you drift off to sleep whether you had a good day or a bad day. You're not thinking about what you acquired, unless it was a moment of joy. Edward Abbey pointed out that action is the antidote to despair. The desert anarchist who was influential for me in my early life pointed out that your to-do list and your awareness of death and the intersection of those two indicates what matters. What matters to you? If there are things that matter to you, I would encourage you to pursue those things. Time is short. There's this great, when I fly out of Belize, where I live now, there's this great sign on the wall. It's from some tour company, I don't even know which one. So they're advertising all these things. They'll take you scuba diving, the deep blue hole, and take you to these islands and blah, blah, blah. But the banner across the top is great. It says there are 7 days in the week. Someday is not one of them. And how many times do you hear somebody say, someday I'm going to do this. Someday I'm going to do that. If that's important to you, I'd put it right there. If I were you, at the nexus of the to-do list and what really matters, identifying what really matters to you. For me, the certainty of death, coupled with the absurdity of life, facilitates my ability to live with urgency and authenticity. I recognize that this is crazyville. Not right here, but I mean outside the walls. Could you have imagined? When I was 10 years old, I can remember my parents. I grew up in a small backwoods redneck logging town in northern Idaho, where people thought it was fun and funny to cut down every tree they could find. And I remember my parents, when I was 10 years old, saying things like, if we keep destroying the planet like this, if we keep cutting down every tree, our kids are not going to have a happy outcome. And that was 48 years ago. I'm stunned I made it this far. We have done nothing but assault the planet in every imaginable way for my entire life. And I'm guilty too. You know, we were all born into this. We were all born into captivity. We showed up and everybody was on this treadmill, so we jumped on the treadmill too, because that's what defines success in this culture, is your ability to jump on the treadmill and get a little bit further ahead than anybody else. That's what we do. There's no blame here. No blame, no shame, no guilt. But it's a crazy world. Can you imagine anything more absurd? The absurd philosopher Camus is an inspiration for me, because he was pointing out a long time ago in the 1950s, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, that the world is crazy. And only by viewing it through that lens of absurdity for me am I able to persist with a smile on my face every day. Because otherwise I might get angry when I see what I and other people have done to the living planet. People ask me all the time, okay, so what should I do? And you know, it's kind of weird, because if a medical doctor knows that you have a terminal condition, knows that you're in stage 4 cancer, and based on the evidence you have 6 weeks to maybe 6 months to live, and your medical doctor doesn't tell you that, well, we call that malpractice. And I think most climate scientists in the world today are guilty of malpractice, and they're not saying what they know because they want support for their jobs. I don't have that problem, that whole job problem. I took care of that years ago because I was saying things like this. So what should we do? Nobody asks their medical doctor, right? The medical doctor gives you a terminal diagnosis, you get 6 weeks or 7 months or whatever. Nobody says, well, what should I do, doc? You know, beyond the medical stuff. Everybody wants to know, first question, because we're bargaining organisms, we want to know, how can I extend that to 6 months instead of 6 weeks? Because compared to 6 weeks, 6 months seems like forever. I mean, I wrote this thing on my blog a few months ago called 7 Threes. And I pointed out that if you only have 3 seconds to live, 3 minutes feels like forever. If you were told that you're going to die in 3 seconds, somebody has a gun to your head, and then suddenly you got a reprieve and it was 3 minutes, you'd go, oh, I have time to make a couple of phone calls. I can scratch out a will. You know, you can do all kinds of things in 3 minutes. And then ramp that up. Go from 3 minutes to 3 hours. If you're told you only have 3 minutes to live and then the doctor comes in, oh, sorry, I was mistaken about that. And you're like, what? Seems like a rather significant mistake, doc. Telling me I have 3 minutes. But then he says, yeah, it turns out you have 3 hours. You're still not going to be all that happy. But 3 hours is a long time, relatively speaking. And so, you know, through the right perspective, through the lens of absurdity, the fact that we're here at all is pretty astonishing. I mean, look at how few previous generations completely screwed the planet without any thought about the future. 7 generations of the Iroquois Confederation? We gave up on that a few generations ago. And yet here we are. As Richard Dawkins, the professor of what is it? Public outreach or something like that in England, says, in the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I who are here, privileged with eyes to see where we are and brains to wonder why. Here we are, in an absolutely crazy world. Could it be any more exciting than that? And not only that, we get to be here at the end. Everybody else left the movie. It's going to be a crazy ending, I promise. Anyway, so people ask me what they should do. I don't know what you should do. I don't even use the word should. But if I did, I would encourage people to remain calm, because nothing is under control, certainly not under our control. When was the last time anybody asked you to pull the strings of empire? So should we invade, I don't know, Syria, Iraq, Iran, China, Middle East? Nobody asked me about that kind of thing. Those things just sort of happen to us, and frequently for our benefit. Nothing is under control, certainly not under our control. There's one exception. A pretty important one, too. What is under our control, what is under your control, is how you treat the people in your life. Any of us can make the people we encounter on a daily basis feel miserable. I'm an expert. I can make people, I can suck the air out of a room in like 10 seconds. I've done it many times. I know how to ruin people's day. I taught poetry in various incarceration facilities. Yes, I actually taught poetry in prison. I was having lunch with a colleague of mine, and I said, oh, look, I have to go. I'm teaching poetry in prison. And he says, is that what they call it now? No. Really, Conrad, I'm not going to my university classroom, I'm going to prison and I'm actually teaching poetry. Anyway, I don't remember where it was. The woman who founded Poetry Inside Out and with whom I was teaching in incarceration facilities, Madeline, calls me Dr. Day Ruiner. And that's nice because most people would just say Mr. Day Ruiner, so at least she gets the title right. We all have that in us. You could wake up in the morning and ruin the day of your significant other or your children or your parents or whoever is in your circle of friends. You could go to work every day and be that miserable jerk who nobody wants to see walking down the hall. We can all do that. So at some level we do have some control, but it's almost always negative. Or we can participate in those daily acts that make us not quite the jerk that we otherwise might be. I've been learning a lot about that lately from people who pointed out that, well, never mind. I encourage people to pursue excellence. I encourage people to pursue love. And there will be no external rewards for any of this, by the way. If you're the person who does the most at your workplace, your supervisor is going to pull you off to the side and tell you you're making everybody else look bad. It happens all the time. Nobody wants the overachiever to overachieve. You look like a jerk. Slow it down so the rest of us can keep up. The absurdity continues. So, despite the absence of external reward, I encourage people to remain calm, to pursue love, and to pursue excellence. And maybe you might want to do this too. You might want to live here now, like your dog does every day. You take your dog on a walk, you're in a park, there's 4 trees and a sun. What does your dog see? 4 trees and a sun. And the squirrel that's strung over there. And that's why the dog is pulling at the leash. And what do you see? You got all this stuff going on in your head. You don't see any of that stuff. You don't see 4 trees, you don't see the sun, you don't see the squirrel. You see the bills that are coming through the door. You see the podium that you're going to be out later today, ruining people's day. You see your car that's breaking down, you see the woman in your life, you see the sperm cell. I'm not sure why that's there. That's a little weird, isn't it? Anyway, so it might improve your day if you spend a little time in your day, instead of projecting into the future what the world might look like, or being miserable about what you did earlier today or yesterday or last week. That's done. The future is not guaranteed. Be here now. Other things we can do, there's a treadmill. At some level we're all on the treadmill, right? And we can't even help it. And because of the profound impact of global dimming, there's really no benefit to jumping off the treadmill as a society. In mass, if we all jumped off the treadmill because it's killing children everywhere in the world as well as the living planet. So we think that might be a good thing, and then the planet warms up so much 6 weeks later because of loss of the global dimming effect. And then we're all dead. So at some level, staying on the treadmill is not such a bad thing, but we all know the people who work way too many hours every day and don't spend any time with their families. And you might be one of those people. I was for most of my life. That's why most people in my family don't talk to me anymore. It took me a while to figure that out. It's okay, when we talked, it wasn't very pleasant, so I'm not sure I'm missing much. And this is something we all do. We're all born into captivity. And we use the expectations of others to reinforce the cell we were born into. And maybe we can let go of some of that too. Some of it is okay. You know, if it weren't for us adhering to societal norms, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation because somebody would have punched me in the nose and run out the door already. You know, so we have something in our brains that overcomes that limbic part of the brain, the reptile brain, that causes us to slow down and use cognition to think. But sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul, says the desert anarchist and atheist Edward Abbey. So specifically, I point out these recommendations like medical doctors would never do. I actually tell people what they should do with their lives, which isn't even nice, probably. And so people ask me, yeah, but what do you do? Well, starting in 2007, I started living off-grid, establishing a homestead that destroyed the last remnants of any relationships I had in the United States. That was in New Mexico. So now I live in Belize, where there's 370,000 people I haven't pissed off yet. I'm working on it. Give me a minute. And so people ask me, what do I do? Specifically, what do you do? As if I'm a model for anything. Did I mention those destroyed relationships already? It's amazing how many people come to me for relationship advice. I'm married 32 years, 10 months, and 17 days, and it's just shattered. Just destroyed that relationship. I have parents who barely talk to me, even though my dad probably doesn't remember who I am at this point because of dementia. But even if he did, right? So people ask me about relationship advice. Are you kidding me? So you probably should have shut off a while ago. So what I do is I try to model the behavior that I would want to come from other people. I try to be relatively calm. I almost never yell at somebody. I try to pursue excellence in what I do. I do what I love. This is what I love. I love having these conversations. I love staying in the homes of my hosts and eating at their tables so we can allow the conversation to go a little longer than it does in this room. And I live in a place that, as nearly as I can tell, the national motto is go slow. Most of Central America, it's all about going slow, being present with where you're at. And so I try to have some gratitude for the enormously privileged life that I've led so far. And more recently, along with the other adults on the property, I'm discussing the unthinkable. What happens when the system goes away? The system that we all depend upon in ways large and small. It's not just the water coming through the taps, it's global dimming. If civilization fails, we lose habitat for our species. If we warm the Arctic beyond the point of having ice, we lose habitat for our species. So we all depend upon each other within industrial civilization. What do we do when it goes away? So I have conversations with the other adults on the property and the people who come and visit about what do we do when it goes away. The conversation nobody wants to have. It's not just about abrupt climate change leading to human extinction. It's how do you leave? Do you commit suicide? How specifically do you do that? Do you assist others in doing that? Well, no, that's illegal.
Get drunk.
Right. You would want to get in trouble. So I've been recently contemplating my own exit as well. When does it get so bad? When does it get so horrible that... And I'm completely non-judgmental, by the way, about suicide. I don't think for most people it's a good idea, but I'm not in your shoes. And I don't know what it's going to be like in the sixth mass extinction when civilization collapses and we have abrupt warning and all of the plants around me are dead and people are going out of their minds even more than they already are. I don't know what that's going to look like, and neither do you. Maybe it'll be like that 1953 short story Ray Bradbury wrote, I forget the title, in which everybody knows they're going to die, it's going to be tonight. Everybody on the planet knows that they're not going to wake up tomorrow. Everybody. And it happens an hour at a time according to time zones. Most that. So like the people in Eastern time zones die first. And so everybody knows. And they know it's going to happen to everybody. Everybody is perfectly calm. Right? So the couple featured in the story, they kiss each other goodnight and they just go to sleep. Maybe it'll be like that. It would surprise me, but we don't know. Until then, we have this enormous privilege of knowing that we're all going to die. We also have this enormous privilege in not being dead yet. So someday we're going to die. And for, I would argue, none of us is that day today. But it might be. You don't know. Louis C.K., the social critic and stand-up comic, has does his great routine. You don't know. The best you can do is, this is probably it. Right? So you don't know. You feel like you're losing consciousness and you might think, oh, I'm 900 years old and I got all these problems and I'm not going to wake up. And this is probably it. But you don't know. Nobody knows they're dead until they're dead, and then you sure don't know. Because you're dead. So, we get to live. That's pretty amazing. In the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I that are here, privileged with the eyes to see where we are, and the brains to wonder why. How great are those odds? We know enough about the structure of the universe to know how many atoms there are. Did you know that? This is what scientists do. They're like 1, 2, 3. So we know how many atoms there are in the universe. And we know a lot about DNA. So we know that, for example, the odds against any one of us being here in physical form exceed the odds against plucking a single atom at random from the entire universe. We're impossible. This physical collection of you that comprises you, which is comprised of thousands of species that you call you, is basically impossible, and yet here we are. It's a miracle. What do we do with that? We live. We live bolder than you can possibly imagine, to the limits of this very restrictive culture and beyond. For you, for me, for us, for here, for now. That's what we have. Thank you very much.